Hey there, and welcome back to another episode of the BB Marketing Asia podcast. I'm your host, Joe Escobedo. Joining me today is Angelyn Varkey, who is the Senior Director, Marketing and Communications, Asia Pacific at Aon. Really excited because this is a topic I think on every senior marketer's mind is influencing commercial growth. Now, I know you have a lot of experience in events of all sizes, and we're talking about how that can lead to the big question, how do I showcase my ROI, which I think most of us are trying to figure out. So let's hear from you.
Sure. So my day job is the good thing about it is that I get to do a lot of events on a small scale, anything between a 1 hour or a 2-day or 3-day kind of conference. And obviously in the last 2 years, it's, obviously taken a much more different shape, which is virtual online. And that's pretty much what we've been exploring. And with the new norm, in terms of where we are heading towards, hybrid is the buzzword at the moment, and that's something that we're exploring.
Yeah, so absolutely. And I think many folks are trying to figure out, what does hybrid mean? Is it essentially just recording a live session and just having people view it from home? Is that what we're talking about when we're talking about hybrid, or is it something different?
So the way hybrids are going to be is that there is an option for you to have it in person, where you have people, the audience in the conference, in a ballroom or in a meeting room, and then you either choose to broadcast it live to a virtual audience, and that's where you need to think about how you keep the online audience engaged at the same time. So with the restrictions now, obviously in various degrees across the world, the online option is still a very much appreciated option because a lot of people can't fly into a single location. Some people because with work from home and you're not in the office, instead of going out to town just for a conference or a meeting, you rather just take it from online. So that's, I think, something that's here to stay. So it's an option that we need to think about as more companies grow the possibilities of in-person. There's a lot of in-person options now, but to keep in mind the virtual audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing goes back to every marketer's mind is how do you showcase ROI? You talked about a couple of different formats from like webinars to in-person events, but what is your approach to assessing and then reporting ROI back to the management team or even yourself?
So I think there are a few things that we need to take into consideration from the get-go, right? In terms of when you think about the events. So let's look at about the scale. So I would say is start with, be it big or small events, it needs to be part of a broader marketing and sales campaign. The closer you are to the bottom of the funnel to drive demand generation, then you need to be working with the sales leaders to create those opportunities in your CRM. So think about a lot of people do this, which is, do you have a calendar of events that it's programmatic, and you're thinking about it in such a way that how do you engage them through that year, through the journey that they're on. So you don't want to cannibalize your own efforts, so pace them out. That's one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of marketers do. So if you think about it as a campaign, then you'll be able to map that out. Back to the point about working with the sales leaders, that's really important because once you have all the data that comes from be it a 1 hour webinar or seminar or a 2-day virtual event or in person or now a hybrid conference, you want to ensure that you gain as much data as possible from all the different various touch points so that you will be able to assess and analyze the insights that you get from that data. And with that, you can go back to your stakeholders and your executives and say, this is what we found out. One thing that is really a gold nugget, I would say, is your post-event feedback form that you have, which is, there's always an important open-ended question that we have is, what do you want to hear about in the next webinar? That really helps shape a lot of the conversations that clients want to hear, and that's topical. Because what you want to present is very different for sometimes what the clients want to hear. So to me, I feel these are little things that will help you achieve that ROI that you're looking for from the events.
I think it's quite interesting because most folks, when they think of the success of, let's say, a webinar, they think of the number of registrations. That's like their primary, like their number one, number two, like not even the quality, it's just how many did you get. So I think it's refreshing that you're not only looking at that, but also what takes place after. For example, you talked about the feedback you're getting, what content or what kind of topics they would cover. Because I've seen some people flip it and they had that drop down and says, would you like sales to contact us? And it goes back to that question, is this a kind of a hard selling kind of thing, or is it a soft sell? And I like your question because it is a kind of a softer sell where you can still spark a conversation. The sales team can spark a conversation with the prospect by knowing what topics they're interested in, versus them just saying, hey, you want to book a call with, one of our salespeople or book a demo, which is like there's a gap between the customer experience there. So I'd love to hear more your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I won't say that there shouldn't be, of course. So I've got 5 KPIs that are really important that needs to be captured. So the registrations and attendees are really important because that's where you decide how much you want to spend on your event. So again, back to whether is it now, do you make it just virtual? Do you make it in person because you have enough numbers? Or is it all based on a certain location? Or is it a regional event where you need to keep it virtual because that's the only way to attract the likes of us, clients in North Asia, for example? So I think registrations is number 1, attendees is number 2. The post-event feedback that I mentioned, it has to be a mixture of multiple choice questions. So both and open-ended questions as well. So multiple choice questions and open-ended questions. And like I mentioned to you, what would you like to hear for the next webinar is one example. And a subset of that would be the performance ratings of speakers. That's really important because if you have a speaker that is able to motivate and influence the audience and get them, really excited about the topic that you're talking about, that is something that was going to earn you brownie points because that automatically will get to that question. Would you like somebody to contact you? It's a domino effect. It will happen. So I think that question is still important. You have to obviously do it very tactfully. And also from a ratings perspective, speakers really popular and resonates well with the audience. You will want to invite them back in the future. So that's another good key indicator. The other parts of the other 4th KPI is to look at the interactive elements. So polls that you do, the Q&A with webinars or virtual conferences, think about gamification. It's a huge game changer. We've done it in the past and it's really helped change the interactions that you have online. And the last piece, which is the call to action, that needs to be very clear. So to your point, if you really want somebody to make a purchase because you've got a 50% discount, depending on, we're talking about a range of industries here. If somebody wants to make a purchase and there's 50% discount, then, that's your call to action. But if for us, for a B2B perspective, it's as simple as download a presentation or, a thought leadership. And that's the kind of, at least you have an engagement from the audience that's immediate.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something so those would be my 5 KPIs that you would look for to be able to help you get into that somewhat of a call to action at the end.
Yeah, interesting. You talked about the very beginning budgets, and I'm keen to hear your thoughts about this because there's, as you mentioned, different types of events. There is the big, let's say, 200 to 500 person events, and then there's like a smaller executive, let's say, we call them roundtables, which are maybe about 10 to 15 people. Now, I'm curious to hear from your point, do you value, in terms of your budget, like the spend, a much bigger event because there's more people? Or do you say this is an ABM approach where we're going to have, say, 10 or 15 senior stakeholders in the room that warrants a higher budget? How are your thoughts in terms of how you break those up in terms of your budgeting?
So very great question. I think it really depends on what you want to achieve. So both, there's no right or wrong to that answer, to that question, because it really depends. So if you're looking at the economic bias, and there's a lot more of the economic bias that you would want to target. And if you're looking at a conference, for example, you may cut and slice your content to make it more bespoke to them. So you might have specific tracks to that particular economic bias so that they would attend those particular sessions. So there are those that is bigger scale, which justifies because you have that group of people that are your day-to-day interactions. But then you would want at some point to also think about interacting with those that are your strategic bias, which is your CFOs, for example, or in our line, risk managers and HR managers, and of course your CEOs. So if you can cater events that are much more smaller, They don't want to be sitting in an audience and just listening to somebody speak. I mean, of course, if you've got a very distinguished speaker, for example, on stage, then of course they would be happy to attend. But with this kind of group of people, if they are going to spend that 1 hour or half a day with you, you want to be able to speak to them and understand what they are thinking about. And in order for you to do that, you need to be able to have a much more smaller group. And that's where with the roundtable discussions, you'll be able to understand what they're thinking about, what's their pain points, what's their challenges, and how an organization is able to help them. So that's where the beauty lies, and there's a magic behind that. And that's where you build longer relationships, and you want to get to that strategic level bias.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering as well, too. And also you talked about the interaction is a bit deeper as well, too, because like I said, we're sitting in an audience 200 or 300 people versus like it's a smaller, more intimate environment. It goes back to what you're saying in terms of like interaction and a bit of gamification. I'm not sure if you can do gamification for a smaller audience, too. I'm keen to hear your thoughts on that one.
I have not tried, so I think it'll be tough. Their attention span and their intentions will be very different. Whereas with the bigger crowd, if you have 300 or even 500, you could do that kind. It'd be fun. You could do a leaderboard. So the motivations are very different.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm wanting to experiment this as well too. Like you say, taking some gamification element and weaving in. So I attended a session. This was pre-COVID, where it was about 15 marketing directors. And the facilitator was really good because he was running like these different like case study exercises with them, and they had to get into groups and they had to come up with the different ideas. And it was a very different approach, I think, than the traditional one person talking to a group of people, because at the end of the day, who wants to listen to anyone talk for that long? So that's something that I think was fascinating for me and something I'd like to experiment with. So yeah, I was curious on that one from your point of view.
Maybe from an in-person perspective, you may not need that gamification perspective, because people would at this point in time want to interact, network. Just the joy of meeting people face to face is very different. I just had that opportunity to do that last week, and I was happy to be meeting people live. I think that the buzz and excitement of in person is going to be there for a bit. So I don't think you need gamification. The whole idea with gamification and why we did it online was because you wanted to encourage positive behavior, which is go to a sponsor's booth, download a white paper, attend your webinars. The more you do that, the higher you get up the leaderboard. But whereas with an in-person event, it is quite the program is quite built in such a way that people will tend to follow it. So be it a half day or a full day. So if people are there, most of the time they're quite committed to stay throughout. So I don't think, but then of course you can do fun things, of course. Raffle draw and all of that still happens.
Yeah, I want to dive a little bit more into gamification, because you mentioned polls and lucky draws and things like that. Are there any other interesting gamification that you've either done for yourself or you've been experienced as an attendee?
Not so much as an attendee, but more as the organizer. Like I mentioned, for our 2-day conference, what we did was, so it was a virtual environment, a 3D environment. So the minute you enter into that 3D environment, you will experience, I guess for somebody who's not been in a 3D environment, you'd be a bit lost. So there would be like the ballroom sessions happening, which is the plenary sessions. Then you have got breakout sessions. So the more you engage and attend, so attending sessions, you gain points, for example. If you download a thought leadership at one of our libraries, you get points. If you visit the sponsors, for example, you get points. If you have a chat with somebody, you get points. And then during the sessions itself, like you mentioned earlier, if you take part in a poll and a Q&A. So we want to see that interaction of an individual. And that's the great thing about virtual. You will be able to capture their footprint very clearly, and whereas with an in-person event, it's not as greatly captured. So you miss some of those data points. So I think the benefit of doing gamification is really see those people who are really engaged, and those people, of course, your prizes that's the other thing, right? Your prizes have to be really good. And let me tell you, during the pandemic, when we sent out prizes and we had like physical prizes, it was a bit of a nightmare because sending them out across the world, because we had attendees from all over, it was a bit of a nightmare logistically. A lot of our gifts were stuck in customs and all of that. But that's something to take into consideration if you're giving out physical kind of prizes. In last year, in 2021, what we decided to do was we decided to give out e-vouchers instead, which was a lot easier. But the only problem with e-vouchers is that's a compliance issue as well. So you need to make sure that it is signed off from your compliance team. So depending on what kind of e-vouchers you're talking about, you can just give something that is where somebody can buy anything. So not an Amazon voucher. It has maybe Amazon books, for example.
Ah, okay. Interesting. I didn't know that, because I think that's the most common one is Amazon vouchers, even Starbucks vouchers. I think most folks do that. But yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
Starbucks is fine because you can only buy food and drinks, so that's right.
Okay. Got it. That makes sense. Interesting. I like the point system. Are there any specific technologies you would recommend to like capture, or is it like a part of the webinar platform?
It's part of the platform. So you will have, so depending on as you review all the different, plenty of platforms out there. So as you review those platforms, take a look at whether they have that capability and that feature within the system. But most event conference platforms should have it.
Okay. Very cool. Okay. And you talked about at the very beginning, the importance of looping in sales. What are some advice or key learnings that you have on the marketing side to really leverage sales and get them involved to the fullest in the events you're running?
Yeah, so I would say these, again, from mistakes that we have done is that one, we never included them from the very beginning. So we would have our briefing sessions with the stakeholders. So I think there's three people that you need to think about. You have the marketing team supporting the different stakeholders who are the content producers. They are the ones who is going to be the speakers and really be able to deliver that particular session. But then there's a disconnect because we don't get the sales team involved from the very beginning. So only when it comes towards the end, once we're done with the event, then they'll be like, okay, here you go. Here are some leads that come through, and hopefully they turn into opportunities. And that's a mistake, and that's something that we're learning. And hopefully moving forward, what we need to do is definitely get them from the beginning, sales teams involved. So think about the target list. Who do you want to invite? Make sure that they're part of that conversation, because the minute that they know that these are like the 50 people, my top 50 clients that I want to invite, then there's a vested interest for them to see that they're invited, they come to the event, and towards the end, there's a follow-up. So the follow-up is a lot easier because they've been engaged from the very beginning. But if you only engage them towards the end when you say, here are the leads, then, there's a bit of a disconnect. So my recommendations from the onset.
Yeah, no, I think it makes sense because, like you said, they have a vested interest since it is their, say, 50 target accounts or people they want to connect with. And also it's about relationship building as well, too, because like you said, if you have them speak at the event or you have them on site of the event, then they can build those relationships. And then to your point, the follow-up becomes much more natural versus them, most marketing just say, hey, here's the leads, check them out. They can just, this is not really a quality lead. And that becomes a whole different conversation, which I'm sure you get.
Yes, happens most of the time. Yes. So that's one way that I've been thinking about, like, how do we make it a bit more jointed? And that point of this is not a qualified lead, because it's a marketing qualified lead, but it doesn't convert into a sales qualified lead. And that's always very frustrating for a lot of marketers.
I'm keen to hear if there's any other key learnings that you've experienced, anything that I haven't asked you around influencing commercial growth.
So I think, again, going back to the objectives, when you have that briefing, be very clear about the objectives and which part of the funnel are you trying to target? Because is it awareness right on the top? Are you just looking at engagement, or are you looking at demand, which is right at the bottom? Obviously, everybody has got different definitions of the funnel. Yeah, so be very clear which part, and then you can target your approach. And it's not just events. Like I mentioned, that events need to be part of a broader sales and marketing campaign. And that means the interactions that you have digitally, whether it's social, paid, or organic, and all the other components that this particular individual would be engaging before they attend the event. So I think that's really important. And that can only be done, not just as marketers, but everybody from the stakeholders through sales need to be involved in that process. And the minute you do that and start tying in all the different individuals and collaborating, that makes it a lot more impactful as a campaign. And then you'll see a lot more, I would say the conversions and the ROIs will definitely sort of be there, because you have a targeted list that the sales team wants to have some kind of interactions with. And that's how marketing will be able to help them through that funnel.
That makes perfect sense. So it's all about, like you said, finding the objectives, agreeing on that target account list you want to go after, and then executing it with the respective stakeholders. You talked about obviously sales, but you mentioned social because that plays a role in promoting the event and the recaps that they're after. For everyone watching and listening to today's episode, really appreciate your support. A lot of really practical tips. I was taking notes in my head, so feel free to share today's episode. I'm sure your colleagues and your bosses would love it. Otherwise, thank you guys so much, and we'll see you on the next episode.